Welcome everybody. My name is Pamela Hughes. For those of you who don't know me, I manage the Friends program here at the Institute, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you and to introduce our speaker today, Caitlin Rizzo, who is the archivist here at IAS. Caitlin is a graduate of Marymount University. And then she went on to do her graduate work at the University of Maryland College Park, where she got a Master of Arts in English Language and Literature, as well as a Master's of Library and Information Science, Archives and Digital Curation. We are thrilled that she's at the IAS. She comes to us most recently from Penn State, where she was head of collection services, and before that, graduate assistant for access and outreach services. Caitlin also worked at University of Maryland as a graduate assistant in the Career Center, as a program manager at the Writers Center in Bethesda, and also at the Library of Congress early on in her career, in the Poetry and Literature Center. I asked Caitlin beforehand if there was some fun fact we might share, and I think she was reticent to do so, but I did say, well, you know, it could be something like, do you like chocolate ice cream? And she said she liked all things chocolate, so she and I have that in common. And thank you, Caitlin, for sharing that. I think without further ado, we'll ask you to get started.
All right. Thank you, Pamela. All right. Well, before we begin today, I just would like to take a moment to thank Pamela Hughes for inviting me to be here today, and to thank all of the friends and members or people from the Institute community more generally who've taken time out of their lunch on this snowy day to be with us. I also want to say a very special thank you to Jennifer Ellis, who I saw here today, and to Shelby White of the Leon Levy Foundation, whose support makes it possible for us to be here today to talk about both the archives and the lands, which Shelby has supported for a very long time at the Institute. So a very special thank you to them. And I think with that, maybe we'll go ahead and get started. As Pamela said, my name is Caitlin Rizzo, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the archivist for the Shelby White and Leon Levy Archive Center at the Institute for Advanced Study. And I am, with that, a very new archivist. I started this position not quite a year ago in March 2021. And I'm very delighted in the midst of this pandemic to have the opportunity to meet all of you here today, even if it's virtually, because I'm very aware that most people on this call have been part of the Institute community for much longer than I have. And as an archivist, that's pretty exciting. And I imagine that it goes without saying, but I feel incredibly privileged to be talking today from the Institute because it's a place with such a tremendous history. And I'm really excited to talk about that history today, but I'm also really excited to learn about that history today. So I'm prepared to talk for about 30 minutes with the hope that we will have time afterwards to share, to discuss, and to learn from each other. With that said, I think this is a great opportunity to just dive right in. So the title for my talk today is A Living Archive, Exploring Ideas of Place and Preservation at the Institute for Advanced Study. And the objective for today is to share a little bit about my own work here and to explore the ways that the Shelby White and Leon Levy Archive Center can offer a space back to this community to engage with its own history and to think about how these histories contribute to our sense of a collective future and not just a shared past. So I want to begin with a bit of an introduction to the Shelby White and Leon Levy Archive Center for anyone who has not been to the Archive Center before, or for maybe it's been a while. The Archive Center documents, collects, and sustains the history of the Institute for Advanced Study. We provide equitable access to the stories at the center of Institute life And we hope to inspire creative and critical engagement with the past in order to promote the value of advanced research for the future. The Archive Center is not only committed to preserving history, but to thinking critically about the politics of that preservation. As an archives, we follow the work of critical theorists and curators like Achela Mbebe and Arnie Lott in actively pursuing policies that promote a sense of what we call radical hospitality and that affirm the value and expertise of all the individuals within our various communities and encourage them to contribute as well. So when I said I'm looking forward to discussing at the end, I really mean it. I would love to hear your stories as well. So I want to point out that much of the work I will talk about today is part of a much larger conversation about the nature of the archive itself. Rebecca Solnit has a wonderful quote that I often return to, that wherein she says, thinking about natural history and human history is like looking at one of those trick drawings, a wine glass that becomes a pair of kissing profiles. It's hard to see both at the same time. And she goes on to add, one doesn't usually write Washington crossed the Delaware, a south flowing river. And especially thinking about our place in history here in Princeton and at the Institute, I thought it might be nice to include that quote. The work I will talk about today actively tries to bridge this gap that Rebecca Solnit identifies. In archival theory, we might refer to this gap as the difference between the archive, quote unquote, as a conceptual space and an imagined space that holds the whole of human history, and archives as a physical space that exists within the confines of the natural environment that surrounds us, with real workers, real tables, and real collections. Archival theorist Michelle Caswell first introduced these ideas, but today I want to try to work towards a third space. When I talk about a living archives today, I would like us to think together about how imagined and theoretical spaces come to bear on physical and natural environments that we live in. I want to show today how we can learn from others to build a more expansive idea of our own history. Of course, the value of expanding our sense of the archive and in turn our history is that it allows us the opportunity to think critically about how we understand ourselves. Archival theorist and Indigenous Koori scholar Shannon Falkhead argues that an archival record can be, quote, any account, regardless of form, that preserves memory or knowledge of facts and events. It can be an actual person, a community, or the land itself. When, as Falkhead mentions, archives come to include living individuals and the land, we have greatly expanded our ability to understand ourselves as we exist in a much greater context. We gain the ability to talk about not only our history, but our history in relation to other human and non-human actors. For the Institute of Advanced Study in particular, this viewpoint can deepen our understanding of who we are. The Institute's website mentions that the corporation was founded in 1930, but those of us who are here today know just as well that our history far precedes 1930. We can, and we do at various times, trace the Institute back to different actors, from Lewis and Carolyn Bamberger Fold's idea to create an intellectual space that would foster the well-being of the population of New Jersey, to Abraham Flexner's first attempts to create a new model of scholarship. Sometimes we even trace that history back to Oswald Veblen's 1927 proposal to Abraham Flexner at the General Board of Education, suggesting that he create an advanced institute for mathematics. Our own records can reveal the sprawling, non-linear nature of our history as an institution. And on this slide, I've included 3 images that aim to depict that. The first image, if we're going in the right corner, is an excerpt from John Casper Wister's first planting plan for the Institute for Advanced Studies campus. The second is an architectural rendering of Fold Hall, an illustration, I should point out. And the third is the planned location of the campus from the York company, the York and Sawyer Associates company that planned the Institute's street map. Each image imagines a campus that had not yet existed at the time of its creation. Much like Flexner's own vision, these sites eventually materialized. The images concretized, and the lands themselves were shaped by the imagination of each of the men involved, from John Casper Wister to Charles Jensen. Their legacies remain an important part of both the nature and the construction of the Institute. But of course, such interventions are not unique. Ooh, sorry, more backwards. Of course, such interventions are not unique. Both the Cultural and Natural Archives record how human and non-human interventions have shaped the lands we today refer to as a home for scholars. Thinking about the archive, we might ask ourselves how this home relates to the many homes that have existed and that continue to exist here today. On this slide, I've gathered images that may be familiar to many of us. On the left-hand slide are images of the interventions associated with creating a home for scholars in the immediate. At the top, we see the blueprints for the IAS machine created by John von Neumann and famously that once lived in the Crossroads building. Below that is an image of the first woman worker at the Institute. She was a member. Workers were referred to as members at the time, or members were referred to as workers at the time. Her name is Anna Stafford Hunrick, and she came here as a refuge when she could find no work as a PhD student in mathematics as a woman. And below, or to the right of that, is a photograph of the historic lounge in Fold Hall, populated by scholars at work. All of these images evoke a familiar vision of the IAS to us as a home for scholarship, community, and innovation. On the other side, I've juxtaposed records that are likely familiar to many of us in a much different context. Ooh, and one is missing, interestingly. Sorry. The farthest right is a map that some of us may be aware of, Nova Belgica at Anglia Nova, published by Dutch engraver Nicholas Vischer II in 1635. That map is based on Adrian Bloch's 1614 rendering of New Netherlands. Next to that is a 1685 map of the Raritan, Millstone, and South River, depicting the area following the defeat of the Dutch by the British for control of the territory in 1664. That map is just prior to the William Penn walking purchase, which took place in 1737. And the image that is not showing, unfortunately, I'm sorry for that, is a contract signed by William Olden and Benjamin Clark, which plots the lands that we know today as Olden Manor. We have another image from that, the original letter. So I will point that out when it comes. And finally, in the top corner is the record of the record of the natural landscape at the Institute, one of the large linden trees that grows on our campus that has been planted for scholars. Each of these images provides a reciprocal context for thinking about the history of the Institute as a home. The Institute lands have been the homes to waves of settlement, migration, and they have also been a place preserved and a place maintained. Over time, even the nature itself has been shaped into an ideal landscape, as we see with the linden tree. The land has become picturesque in an attempt to preserve certain aspects of its history and to inspire a certain kind of future. And yet, when we explore what has been preserved, we might also ask ourselves what has been forgotten. This slide depicts only a small part of the homeland of the Indigenous peoples that continue to claim the Institute and these lands as part of their sacred territories. The archaeological record tells us that the earliest physical evidence of peoples in North America extends to over 11,500 years ago. As early as 1,000 years ago, the archaeological record reveals the presence of indigenous peoples, which have come to be called by various names. These names include the Lenni Lenape, the Nanticokes, the Delaware, and the Munsee, but there are several others that we can see on this map, including the Sanhekins and the Navasings. Their presence is affirmed in the names of the communities around us and the presence of cultivated and tended lands that are depicted on this map. And this map, by the way, comes from Robert S. Grumet's The Munsee Indians of History. These stories are, of course, integral to understanding the context of this place that we call home today. The stories of contact between the various groups of European settlers and indigenous communities are limited in cultural records of archives, but they're significant in trying to understand the histories of migration, displacement, and diaspora that resulted in the formation of the land as we imagine it today. The European settler imagination may have shaped the plots we see around us, but from the Falls of Trenton to the trails of the Assunpink and paths of what was known as the Unami-speaking Delawares of Lenape-Wahitic, indigenous imagination provides the foundation for understanding certain lands around us as desirable and livable. And I'll also add that this map reveals the territories of the 1680s, and anywhere you see gray, including right around the Millstone River, which would be Princeton, there is a treaty. These stories are, of course, integral to understanding the over time, European imaginations naturalized the boundaries and borders used by indigenous communities, creating their own narratives about why certain land was desirable and suitable for their cultivation. Of course, this imagination had reciprocal effects. European migrants forced native peoples onto undesirable lands and reservations. As Europeans used their own social conventions, creating deeds and records to demarcate their property, they also created their own narratives about how they had come to see these lands. Often Europeans, including Quaker communities like the Olden family, whose land is depicted to the right, saw the lands as part of a greater narrative for their own persecution and migration. And of course, we could argue that before we began to see the lands of the Institute as a refuge for scholars and a home for scholarship, the Institute lands had already been the site of refuge for generations of individuals of different origins. Part of the most exciting aspects of this research is thinking about what our community narratives reveal about our past, our present, and our future. The images in this slide depict various records that reveal the way our community has oriented itself to the Institute lands. The images in the slide depict that is also missing, apologies. One of the images in the slide is supposed to be the 1936 Site and Ground Committee papers revealing what lands were acquired and from who before the construction of Fold Hall. The bottom image is the 1976 Walker's map from Frank A. Lepper, who was a member of the School of Historical Studies, who spent his year here working on a trail map of the Institute grounds. And to the right is the Institute map that many of us know today. This map was based off of the 1976 map, but has since been updated to depict more information about the wildlife around us. I'm sorry about the issues with images. I'm not sure why some are not showing up on the Zoom. This slide, the more recent records beg the question, how do we in this moment orient ourselves? And I've included a quote here from Lucy Lippard. Like the places they inhabit, communities are bumpily layered and mixed, exposing hybrid stories that cannot be seen in a linear fashion, aside from the preserved examples which usually stereotype and oversimplify the past. The lack of common history and the habit of transience means that even well-meaning efforts at community can lack substance, while an excess of shared history can lead to feuds and cultural confinement. Mainly, I want us to remember that as we talk about community and about the different communities that have been preserved, that have inhabited and continue to habit the Institute, remember that community is not always easy. With that in mind, I would like to open us into a bit of a discussion and have a chance to hear more about the history of the Institute from the Friends' perspective. I've offered a few questions for us to think through today as we talk, including how we can participate and situate ourselves within a dynamic and living archive, what we can gain by being deliberate in our attempts to preserve the visions we share for our environment, and how we can sustain our attention to the future of others who call these lands home. And I also want to leave you with a couple of invitations to participate in the archive. So I've included ways that you can learn more about our archives, which include my contact information, but also the archive's website and the archive's digital collections where many of these images live at the Albert repository. I've also included an invitation from some of the ongoing work the archives has been engaged in along with our faculty and members to support Indigenous community. Suzanne Conklin Akbari will be helping host a night of storytelling with the local Muncie Delaware Nation community scholars Ian McCallum and Karen Moscow. Suzanne's work is deeply invested in language revitalization for the Anami language and the Muncie languages that were spoken in our region. So if you are interested in those histories, you are welcome as members of this community. And I will leave it there and open us to conversation.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Are the Friends keeping an archive?
We have an archive. That is a great question, Shelby. We do have an archive of material from different Friends members. We have the Amias archives, and we have oral histories from different Friends. But I think that might be a question to give back to the community. So I would like to, kind of further that and say not just as a group, but as individuals, are there individuals here who feel like they have archives to share?
There may be Friends who have archival materials, and it would be an interesting thing, I think, for us to put out there in a wider context. Yeah. I'm wondering whether, since you mentioned Suzanne, is Suzanne still on? Suzanne Akbari?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. I don't think I see her. I was going to suggest maybe she wanted to say a few words about the work that you've been doing. Would you perhaps say a little more about that, Caitlin?
I'd love to say a little bit more
Great.
about that. So Suzanne's work is deeply invested in language revitalization, but through Suzanne and through the community, we've been able, as the libraries and the Archive Center, to start being involved in efforts to bring the Muncie Delaware community back to the Institute in various forms, just to bring their presence back to the place where they started and lands that are sacred to them. So that has included things like events. Suzanne has been working with the Native and Indigenous Studies group at Princeton to bring a yearly conference that has Muncie Delaware Nation representatives and representatives from other Indigenous peoples in America to the Institute and to Princeton's Firestone Library to talk about their history with the land. in the libraries recently, we've been able to commit to creating a space for Indigenous presence in our collection. So we are, with Marcia Tucker's help, assembling both a digital and a physical space that will include information about the Indigenous communities and the lands of the Institute for our members and our faculty and our community widely to check out, to experience. And we're also participating in research. So one of the things that I've been really happy to help out with is a project to gather a genealogical database of names in the archival record for Chief Mark Peters, who is one of Suzanne's contacts in the Muncie, Delaware community, and Stockbridge, Muncie in Northern Canada, which is part of the diaspora. That's slow work, but it's work that we're really happy to do. So I think an important thing for me as I come on board is to think about how these relationships enrich our understanding of the Institute and ourselves, and how we make strong partnerships and bonds with communities that can support our goals and with communities whom we can support as well.
Other questions, comments?
And I am happy to answer questions about some of the images that did not make, I'm sorry for the technical snafu. I'm not sure. They're on my screen, but then when they shared, they disappeared. So I am sorry for that. My apologies.
Caitlin, I have a question for you. In your times, since you are so new to the Institute, what has struck you as very curious about the land and the Institute? Has there been anything?
So many things. I love this question. I think one of the things that has struck me is the faculty advocacy and maybe the community advocacy right broadly around the lands. So there were included in the slides and pictures that I did not call out necessarily of Oswald Veblen, who is known for, he was the Austrian mathematician who was one of our founding faculty, Austrian-American mathematician, apologies. And he was known for going out into the woods and chopping down the trails that we walk today. So when we talk about the trails in the back, they were created by our faculty. Chern's oral history project actually talks about being handed an axe by Oswald Veblen, and Veblen looking at his hands and saying, "Oh, you don't have the calloused hands to do this hard work." And Chern feeling like, never again will I come out for this project. But at the same time, we have smaller interventions. The gypsy moth invasion in the 1980s saw a local botanist, Preston Tuttle, come to the Institute with information about how to eradicate gypsy moth eggs and larvae, and faculty from Enrico Bomberi to the Delines actually went out and counted how many eggs they eradicated. I think the Institute often thinks of itself as an abstract location in its records, at least, and kind of an intellectual space. But one of the things that I really enjoy about engaging with the history of the land at the Institute is just how physical and involved this community has been in caring for the land and for ensuring its preservation.
Wondering whether the construction that's going on the campus recently, has that had any archaeological implications? Have archaeologists been involved in any of the, I don't know, excavation that might have been going on, and has anything new come to light?
That's a great question. I will say I am the expertise of the past at the Institute. So I know that in the past, the archival record reflects that there has been archaeological work at the Institute, an examination of the Institute lands. as far as if that is actively happening around the construction, that might be a question for the current administrators, sorry, that are involved in the construction. I might know if you give me 5 years, maybe I'll be able to answer. But I think that that's a great example of how we can get involved. I think these are great questions to ask of ourselves and of the area around us.
Thanks.
A quick question. First of all, welcome. Do you see the Institute, which hosted refugees during the World War II, which was certainly not the design of the Institute when it was founded? So that was one of these nonlinear developments that fits into your narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Can you also place those scholars who ended up here within this much broader context that you have been discussing that go back thousands of years?
Yeah, I think one thing that really excites me, and one of the things, I'll be honest, that started this work was thinking a little bit about the narrative that the Institute presents, and it's kind of opening, welcoming documentation to people about the idea of being both a home and a refuge. Those two things, I think Pamela mentioned that I have a background in literature and poetry. Those two things are distinctly separate, right? To be a home is permanent, to be a refuge is to be displaced from home. And that really became a sticking point in how I was understanding the Institute, trying to think through what it meant to be both a home and a refuge. And I think one thing that I tried to point to a little bit, but I didn't say as expressly in this presentation, is that the Institute's lands have been a refuge for actually a very long time. So one of the things about where we are located, and most Princetonians will feel this very acutely, right? That we are not in the major ports. We're not in Philadelphia. We're not in New York, but we are in this second space. And so even for the Indigenous peoples, the falls at Trenton and Assunpink were the main areas that were productive in terms of fishing and hunting. The rivers themselves, so the Millstone and the Raritan, were very, what we would call the Millstone and the Raritan, were very productive and fertile spaces for living in small community. And yet this area tended to be passed over in a way. It wasn't until space became increasingly contested and migrations were starting to happen during the contact era that this space started to become increasingly more useful. And one thing that's interesting about this space is it was kind of the undesirable land when people were moving into the interior to move away from kind of those port places that were true contact zones that large populations were coming into. In the same way, I think we can think about the stories of refuge for scholars moving out of Göttingen in 1933. You know, the story of many of our mathematicians and our early World War II scholars is that in 1933, Hitler expelled Jewish and Jewish affiliated scholars from Göttingen. If we think about coming into a place of refuge, Princeton and its surrounding area has for a long time been a place of refuge where if you were forced out of a different area, you came. And I think that there's something really fruitful and really interesting in thinking about the way that our land now is designed to be kind of insular and protected. We famously, as a town, passed over kind of easy navigation into the cities. When we created the canals, we designed Princeton to be a little bit more hidden and kept away from major urban spaces. And part of the design of our land is in this story of refuge and not necessarily hiding, but being protected. And I think that that can be said for those scholars as well.
Pamela, I have a question. It's Ralph Widener that builds on your comments about the role of the Institute as a refuge. one of the more fascinating chapters in that story is when the Institute, right after Full Hill Hall was built, provided refuge for part of the League of Nations. And given Woodrow Wilson's role in the history of Princeton and the League of Nations role that he played, I thought that was a particularly fascinating chapter of the Institute. How much archive do we have about what they did when they were in Full Hall during the war? And it seems to me there's a book there.
There definitely is. I would love for someone to write it. There is a lot of information in the archives about this era. I will say that the nature of governmental records and organizational records, right, is that there will be some records that remain with the organization itself. So the League of Nations records are the most robust about what was done during that time. But the Institute does maintain quite an extensive amount of documentation about the League of Nations at the Institute. During the time, the School of Politics and Economics was, the faculty from the School of Politics and Economics was still very much active at the Institute. We were having regular conversations. And of course, the Institute's involvement with the Atomic Energy Commission and weapons development in World War II meant that there are so many avenues, be it director's office correspondence with contracts or speaker events where individuals from within the League of Nations would hold seminars. There is actually just a plethora of information about that time. Now, some of it is a little bit tedious, I will say, having gone through the contracts sometimes. They're a little bit of a bore, but we also have really beautiful images taken as part of the, I think it's Life or Time magazine did a spread on the League of Nations at Princeton. And we have press clippings from the era as well. So some beautiful images too. Though always looking for more, that time period is increasingly sought after. So I would, if anyone here has any stories or
There's another story, but I'm not sure it'd be in the archives. And this was in the early stages before the Nation of Israel was actually created. But the director of the Institute at that time was on a commission. It was making recommendations about whether such a state should be created and what the US position should be. And he and Einstein had a lot of interchanges about this because Einstein had strong views on that topic. And I wonder, did that find its way into your archives? Or is that somewhere else?
Director's correspondence from the time, I think we have some of it, and we do have some of Einstein's letters, which is actually something that most people don't realize about the Institute archive. While Einstein's papers reside in Israel, the faculty letters and the administrative documentation from Einstein's tenure as a faculty at the Institute does reside with us. And we do have quite a few records regarding his kind of thoughts on the administration more broadly. Especially, we have very well documented the feuds between Abraham Flexner and Albert Einstein, which are some of my favorite documentation in the archives. I have to admit, they're pretty funny. So I can't think of a letter in particular that would be kind of watershed documentation that wouldn't be better expounded in Einstein's personal papers, but I can say that we do maintain documentation between the director and the faculty. So there is some. And I think the other thing to be aware of is Jewish philanthropy and Jewish identity is so well documented in our archive, especially the documentation around Jewish assimilation in the 1930s and the role philanthropy played in Jewish assimilation in the 1930s is tremendously well documented. We even had a scholar at Princeton, Laura Jean Porter, came to the Archives Center and to the Institute to do research on her dissertation. So we actually have a 400-word dissertation about Jewish identity formation in the 1930s that is to do exactly with how these political questions came to bear and play out on the formation of the Institute and its earliest faculty. And I think is one of kind of the richest minds in our institutional history in the archives. So I think that's a great story, and I would love to hear more.
Thank you, Ralph. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay. Well, Caitlin, I can't thank you enough. We are really delighted that you've come and join us today. And please all know that Caitlin's door is open. She welcomes visitors to the archives, and you can also get in touch with her on email. If you have anything to add to the archives, please do get in touch. And we hope that we'll have the opportunity to do something with you in person before too long.
And I will also just say we had our first Institute Pond ice skater today. So if you're nearby in Princeton and you want to be skating.
The white flags are up. Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. Enjoy the snow.